All right, so this is going to be a YouTube case study. I'm going to be going over my older brother, Kyle Cherico. I'm going to be going over his deadlift programming and a little bit of his bench press. So we'll start with background information. He's a very experienced lifter. He's been lifting for probably around 15 years from now. He actually got me into it, so it's kind of a cool little full circle moment that I coach him now. But along with that, he doesn't power lift competitively. He kind of just does that as a hobby. He also doesn't do squat, bench, and deadlift. He just benches and deadlifts. And he has a lot of muscle mass on his frame. Now, why that's important is that kind of paves the way for the direction we're going to go with his programming. So for him, since muscle's not the main limiter of his progress, probably going to be skill development. And when I say skill development, I mean just having better technique so that he can move more efficient. Because muscle is going to increase our potential to be strong. He already has most of that, though. That's not the main problem here that we need to solve. It's really just going to come down to technique. Are we moving in the most efficient way possible so that we can express the strength that we actually have? Keyword there is express, show the strength that we actually have, which is kind of what powerlifting is. We're showing the strength that we have built or we're in the process of building. So for him, we focus a lot on technique, but not all through verbal cueing. I use a lot of movement constraints with him because I just know that it feels better for him to say and do things that are more like, okay, feel this. Do you see what this feels like? That just resonates with him better. As opposed to more verbal cueing. So obviously there's a time and place where we use it, but most of it's going to be through movement constraints. I'm going to get to that eventually. And then really the last couple things on the background info is he's really short on time. Time's going to be like his biggest constraint for making his program. So he only trains twice a week just because he's very busy. And then for deadlift, he deadlifts once a week. And then he has a history of low back pain with conventional deadlifting. So that was something psychologically we had to kind of overcome too. For a while, he wasn't able to do anything over 300 pounds. And he also needed a belt. It was almost like I need this to be safe kind of thing. And using the belt too much to create the brace rather than using the belt as a reference to see how much you're actually creating for a brace. So that's really it for the background info. And then what we're going to go into is his technique and his programming. So I'm going to kind of bounce back and forth between the technique and the programming because they interplay a lot here. So what we are going to notice here is we have a 2-count pause deadlift, cluster deadlift, a 4-count tempo eccentric, and then a normal competition standard conventional deadlift. So I'll get into the reason why it's in this order eventually, but first thing, let's just address why we're doing these exercises. So 2-count pause. We're doing a 2-count pause to have him reinforce creating leg tension off of the floor and not rushing it. And along with that, not using his upper back to pull it off the floor, rather push it with his legs, kind of more like a leg press. This also allows him to make sure he's over the middle of his foot because that's also been something we've needed to work on. The clusters, so when I say cluster, I mean he does 1 rep, he waits 45 seconds, he does another rep. So we can really look at it in this case like 6 sets of 1 rather than 1 set of 6. There's other benefits to that too, but in this case, we're doing the clusters so that he can practice his setup more frequently because the deadlift is really all about setup, I'd say, or mostly setup oriented, as well as the other power lifts, but especially deadlift because what's different from a deadlift, compared to a squat or a bench press is we don't have that eccentric loading phase. And the eccentric loading phase is important because it allows us to develop some awareness of where our body is in space. So what I mean is, let's take a squat, for example. So for a squat, if you let's say you're fairly aware of how your body moves and you're starting far back on your heels. As you descend down into the squat, you're probably going to feel like you're shifting forward. And then when you come back up, you're going to probably feel like you're shifting backwards. So descending with weight on your back allows you to have some awareness like, hey, I'm actually shifting forward here. Something else is probably going to happen after this. With something like a deadlift, though, when we start at the bottom, we don't have that initial phase that's going to allow us to create awareness for where we actually are in space because we aren't resisting any weight yet, especially because the weight is in our hands, it's not on our back. And because we're not resisting any weight yet, and we're almost starting from a static position, I mean, the wedge kind of helps alleviate that a little bit, but just say we're starting from more of a static position. That means our technique needs to be really efficient for something like a deadlift. Now, the pause allows you to really feel that out because you literally have to pause and wait for 2 seconds in this case. And that can be really beneficial for just creating awareness. Now, the tempo eccentric, similar idea. So instead of pausing on the concentric, which is what we're doing here, the tempo eccentric, where we have more control over the load, counting 4 seconds on the way down is also going to help feel out the center of mass because, like I said, the eccentric phase of any lift really, is going to allow you to be in the position that you're supposed to be in on the concentric. So more often than not, when people have issues with their starting position, if we do something that focuses more on the eccentric almost puts them in the correct position. So like if he's starting really far back on his heels, if I give him a tempo eccentric and we notice those second, third, and fourth reps, he's over midfoot perfectly fine, then we can probably point to, okay, well, maybe we just need to develop some more awareness. Like, okay, this is what the middle of my foot feels like. That's why this second rep feels better than the first rep. So there's really just a lot of stuff in here to help develop a positional awareness, we'll say, with center of mass. Okay, so getting into the technique a little bit more. So really like the main thing has been managing center of mass a little bit better. Now, when I say center of mass, I'm really talking about the point where we're going to be able to produce the most amount of force, because powerlifting is something where we're lifting very heavy. We need to produce a lot of force. So in the case of a deadlift, the center of mass is going to be the middle of his foot, which is going to be kind of right in front of the shin somewhere here. So in between those metatarsals and the heel. Now, to be over the middle of your foot, you ideally want contact in your inner heel, the outside edge of your foot, and your big toe / first metatarsal. So that kind of ensures that we're over the middle of our foot, because if we have too much heel pressure, for example, and the toes are off the ground, then we're probably not over midfoot. We're probably behind it, and that can create its own problems. Now, I'm actually going to talk about that here. So this video was 3/17, so this was in March, and this actually followed a vacation, so there's a little bit of detraining here. And what you'll notice initially is his toes are kind of hovering off the floor a little bit. And what that means right off the bat is he's sitting more in his heels. He kind of just tends to naturally hold his body weight more in his heels, which is behind the center of mass. Now, or behind the center of mass because it's behind midfoot. Now, in the case of a deadlift, that could create some problems with the starting position, especially because we don't have that eccentric loading phase and we're starting statically. We don't have anything to give us feedback that, hey, you're actually behind midfoot. And what that often leads to is someone's hips shooting back and their weight shifting forward. Because this happens, now we have to kind of overcompensate, and then our weight shifts back again, and then we get too far behind the bar, and now we have lockout issues and we can't fully lock out a deadlift. All of that, or at least most of it, stemming from not being in a good starting position. So what you'll see here it's a good way to see it. Could be, you could look at two areas. You could look at the hips, you'll see that they rise, or you could look at this gap between the toes and the floor. You'll see it starts here, but then once he's actually initiating the pull, that gap between his toes starts to close and the hips rise back. So right about here, you can see that there's no more gap. His toes are in fact on the ground, and what happened with that was his hips rose back, and now this looks more like an RDL. All of that stemming from him starting too far behind the center of mass. So if this is the center of mass, he's starting too far behind it. Well, we're going to find a way to get over that eventually so that we can produce force. So what we end up doing is overcompensating. Now we're in front of the center of mass. Okay, now this is a problem. We still need to get back to midfoot to produce force. Now we overcompensate again, and now we're behind it again, and you'll see this at lockout because the toes actually start to come off the ground a little bit. Right there. He almost looks like he's going to fall backwards. And now he's too far behind his midfoot, which also means he's a little bit too far behind the bar, and that's part of the reason why he can't achieve full lockout here. So having a better center of mass in the starting position has really been a main focus for us. Along with that, creating more leg drive. So when I say leg drive, I really mean using the quads to push the floor away throughout our setup. Now he doesn't have like a traditional wedge, meaning his hips don't rise and then come back down to the bar to allow this to happen, just because we've tried it before and it really doesn't seem necessary. It also tends to exacerbate his problem of starting too far back because he ends up over wedging. So what I mean by that is, if we look at this here, even with a static start, he tends to just kind of sit back almost like a squat sometimes. So hopefully you could see that if he rose his hips back and then had to bring them close to the bar, that would just probably put him in a pretty similar position. Now, there are some things that we could do to work around that, but I'd rather just stick with this for now. So keeping the static start, something that we have implemented to increase leg tension is literally just telling him to drive the floor away as he's descending down, because that's going to keep his hips high so that it's not looking more like a squat. That's going to allow his glutes and his hamstrings to do a better job, and also the adductors to some extent, to lock out the hips for hip extension. And along with this, we're also looking to make the arms longer. Now, when I say make the arms longer, I don't actually mean artificially make the arms longer in a lab. What I really mean is freeing up his shoulder blades. He tends to hold a lot of tightness in his straps and his upper back, and because of that, he's going to be in more scapular retraction, like this. Because he's in more scapular retraction, if we just look at my arm, when I pull my shoulder blades back, see how it got shorter, and see how when I protract it forward, they got longer. So when I say make the arms longer, I really mean start in more scapular protraction, because if our arms are longer, we're going to probably be able to keep our hips higher. We're just going to have a better deadlift leverage in general. So that's been another goal for us. And if we think about pushing the floor away with the quads, if we keep the upper back relaxed, hopefully you could see that actually allows us to move into protraction because we're creating tension with our legs. So if we have the upper back loose, to some extent, maybe we're pulling down into some depression, but it's relatively relaxed. If we now push with our legs, that's going to artificially make my arms longer already. So increasing leg tension, decreasing some upper back tension, giving him a better leverage, which is exactly what he does here. So this was 400 pounds, most recent PR, 55-pound PR with me. We don't exactly know what it was before. Huge benefit of this too is it was also beltless. Before I mentioned you had to kind of rely on the belt to feel safe as the first thing, but also because you didn't really know how to brace as effectively. Something else that helps with the protraction is creating more of a brace, because what we do is we actually open up space on the backside of the rib cage to breathe in air, and for something like a deadlift that can be very beneficial. So if we just watch this pull, it was very clean. And I'd say it's probably one of the cleaner pulls I've ever seen from him, if not the best. And it was with a near max slash max attempt right now. And what you can see that he does a lot better here than he was doing over here was not sitting behind the bar. And you can see his hips are a lot higher here and his upper back's a lot more relaxed. You can see that his arms look longer. His scapula looks more protracted. So we also brought in the grip a little bit too. That also kind of helps to get the arms a little bit more forward and longer. But regardless, now we can kind of get into the programming side of things and how these things have some interplay. So what I did with the 2-count pause, like I said, was to increase his awareness of his center of mass and also kind of let him know, like, hey, if you pause this but you start in your heels, this is going to be very hard from where you're pausing it from. So it kind of shows him like, oh, okay, if I start in the wrong position, this is going to be a lot harder than it needs to be. If I want it to be easier, I'm going to really make sure I'm starting in the right position. So that's part of it. But I think that positional awareness is a bigger part of it. And the reason I sequenced it in this order, that's really what I'm going to get to next, is firstly because of time. So, like I mentioned, he is limited on time. So, if we just break down 2 common strategies to program for someone, we have this like top set, back down set approach. Then we have this ascending set approach. So when I say top set, back down set, I mean we warm up to this heaviest set of the day, and then we back down after. We drop the weight, we drop something, and then we do some back down sets. That typically is going to take more time than doing an ascending set. Ascending set literally just means something's getting harder as the set goes on. It's usually going to be in the form of RPE or weight or a combination of both, usually a combination of both. So in the case of an ascending set structure, the warm-ups in the first few sets are kind of mixed, because if we're doing an ascending set, that means the first few sets are going to be a lower RPE relative to the top set, which means maybe we did, I don't know, like 225 in our warm-ups up to a top set, but now 225 is the first set of ascending sets. Hopefully you can see how that can kind of cut down time. And then the other thing with that too is if like psychologically, if we're someone who gets really hyped up or really wrapped up in our lifting, when we do a top set, maybe that's when we use the most of that hype, that energy. By the time we get to the back down sets, we're totally drained and weights feel heavier than they need to be. So let's say you did like 275 on your back down sets, but you just feel drained and it moved to like a RPE 8. Switching to something like an ascending set approach, on paper, you might think, well, this 275 should maybe not move any better than an RPE 8. But because we've spared our arousal levels because we didn't do a top set before, all of a sudden 275 is like a RPE 5 or a 6. So that's another consideration for that too, is it can kind of help create some more momentum within the session using an ascending set. But like I said, we mainly did this for time. So what he did before this set structure, so we did a 6x1 cluster, and then one set of 1 with a tempo eccentric, and then one set of 1 with a competition single. Before this, we did something along the lines of this. So we had the tempo eccentric first still, then the comp single, but then we had 7 sets of 1 cluster, but it was a back down set, so it was minus 12%, and that was still taking too much time. So what we just did was put the lighter stuff first and the heavier stuff last, to put it simply. Now the lighter stuff is going to be the higher rep stuff most of the time, so in the case of this, that's going to be the cluster set. So instead of doing a back down percentage, I kind of just picked the percentage that was roughly what he was doing before. So in this case, starting with like 70, 72% for 6 set of 1, 2 count pause, cluster set. Then we moved into the tempo eccentric. He's not going to be able to tempo eccentric as much as his comp deadlift. That's going to be the second lowest amount of weight being used. And then the final set is going to be his competition set. That's where he's using the most amount of weight. Now, another added benefit to doing this for him is also we kind of get this priming effect with this technique, meaning by doing these movement constraints first, it almost warms up his technique and gets it going to where it needs to be so that he actually ends up being stronger to some extent and performs better when that top set, that competition set is last, because we've been able to work on the technique with variations that put us in a position that we want them to be in, aka a movement constraint. So in the case like the paused cluster allows us to practice the setup more frequently, and then the pause allows him to manage his center of mass better, have patience off the floor. We do that, okay, cool. We're going to remember to translate this into the competition deadlift after. And then when we do the tempo eccentric deadlift, kind of reinforces that positional awareness, like, okay, I'm doing 4 seconds on the way down. I'm not doing a full reset at the bottom. This is what my starting position is supposed to be like. I'm going to remember what that feels like. So whether it's center of mass, whether it's how high my hips are, whatever it might be. And then now that we have these 2 data points from doing the pause cluster and doing the tempo eccentric, now when we go ahead and do that competition deadlift set, there's not much thinking needed because we just did 2 movements, 2 variations that kind of did all the thinking for us. And then as a result, the technique is a lot better. So I think that was another interesting benefit to programming it like this. Now, the reason I brought up, I'm going to go into bench press a little bit here too, is the taper. So it's more evident in the bench press, which is why I'm going to show it here. So bench press, nothing crazy happened really, but I'm just going to show how I did the same thing pretty much. So I did the higher rep stuff first, lower rep stuff last. So what this means for the taper is, what I would do is instead of really pulling back any competition work, I would just move the top set order up each week. And because I moved the order of that up, that is in essence a taper because we are pulling off fatigue. And we're pulling off fatigue just by changing the set order because every set that we're doing is creating some level of fatigue. So even if what I said, this top set being last, it makes the technique better, there was still some fatigue incurred on these first 2 sets, or these first 7 sets, however you want to look at that it's going to limit his ability to express his strength maximally to some degree. So showing it on bench press, if I just move this 1 set of 1 up in the order each week, like I do here, I'm essentially gaining a taper, but in this case I'm also gaining some momentum because if it moves up each week, that's going to allow me to add load better each week, so there's also the added benefit of momentum. Now, I just showed it with bench press because we had more sets, so it was easier to actually see that. With deadlift, we didn't actually do that each week. We kept this same 6x1, 1x2, 1x2. We actually did this, the 2s week 1, to limit load so we didn't load up too much too soon. Then we transitioned to the singles. So we did 6x1, 1x1, 1x1 for week 2. Same thing for week 3. But then week 4, it was just a single, no back down sets. So we got the taper because we didn't do a paused cluster or a tempo eccentric before our top set. So that's one cool, I guess, little benefit too, is we don't really have to taper that much because we're just moving the set order around. So it's not like I had to make this a 3x1 or something to reduce the workload. So that was another added benefit there. And then one last thing I wanted to include here was why I put this B stance RDL in here. So this was just kind of another thing to work on the positional awareness. So with this B stance RDL, I was able to be with him in person, and what I did was I put my hand in front of his knee, and I had his knee in line with his toe or slightly over it. And I just told him, push your hips back, but don't let your knee move off of my hand. And what that does is it teaches someone to keep more forward foot pressure, especially for someone who sits back in their heels more. Because in actuality, the knee's going to move back a little bit, and it's going to get them over the middle of their foot. Because when they have more forward foot pressure, if it's relative to being in the heels, it's probably actually closer to midfoot and not actually on the toes, which is could create other issues. So in that case, having the B stance RDL allows him to feel, okay, this is what more forefoot pressure feels like, what more midfoot pressure feels like, by having that external reference of my hand saying, don't let me move this. Now, if you don't have someone to actually do that, what you could do is just take a foam roller and put it in front of your knee and put that against the wall, and then all of a sudden you have another reference to keep that center of mass forward, and you could get the same idea that I talked about here with the technique priming. It's almost like getting your body ready for that position without as much thinking. So that's why we did the B stance RDLs, and getting a little bit of rotation, open up the backside of the hip, increases ability to internally rotate, which was another thing that we needed to improve over time as well. Just generally making things feel good. But yeah, that's about the extent that we had for warm-ups. So to sum all of this up, I know there's a lot of information there, but with Kyle, he hit a 400-pound deadlift, and that's a 55-pound PR from how much we can remember. We worked around pain. Sometimes there might have been a low back flare-up every now and then, but we also worked on developing his technique. The points of technique that we really looked to develop was managing his center of mass better, increasing leg drive, and making his arms longer, all to give him a better leverage, actually use his quads, his glutes, his adductors, his hamstrings, more than his upper back to push the floor away rather than pull it off the ground. And then some interventions that we used to do so mainly came through movement constraints. So when I say movement constraints, I mean exercises that are going to force someone to move in a particular way that we want them to. So in the case of a pause deadlift or a tempo eccentric deadlift, both of those things are going to help create awareness of what something feels like, because we're making something take longer than it normally does. That allows us to actually feel it out and not be caught up in so much like sympathetic nervous system state where we're in more fight or flight reacting. But if things have to slow down, we've got to think a little bit more. We can actually feel what these positions feel like. So that's what I mean by when I say a movement constraint. Now, there was also some technique stuff, some verbal cueing that we used. Mainly was relax the upper back, and then also with the slack pull, having him push the slack out of the bar like he does here, and then pulling from there. That almost mimics what a wedge is doing. We just didn't incorporate a wedge because I didn't really feel like that was necessary for him. But that also helped address the center of mass stuff a lot, because doing this little push before he pushes again with his legs, it kind of helps to confirm that he's over his midfoot. So that was also massive. But yeah, so we mainly use movement constraints, a little bit of verbal cueing to help him improve his technique over the past year or so. And he hit a PR. And then we went over the programming, we went over the movement constraints. We also went over the ascending set structure to fit within his schedule, which I think is a very important thing, is you work with what you have, with the person in front of you, not trying to fit them into a certain mold. So if he can only train 2 days a week, I'm not going to make him train 5 days a week. You're just not going to get anything done with that. And using some creative programming strategies by just putting the heavier stuff last, so that those first few ascending sets can almost be like warm-up sets, can help things take less time. Now, sure, there was some other stuff in here that also helped with time. Not going to go into all that here, but regardless, that's kind of what we did for his programming and his technique to help him hit a PR. He obviously did all of it, so I can't really take any of the credit for that, because he tried and he listened, and he's just been a good athlete despite being very busy. So yeah, hopefully something was taken out of this. I haven't done something like this in a long time, but let me know if you have any questions or comments about anything, and that's it.